welcome to my YouTube video. My name is Suzanne Bryan. In this video, I'm going to show you 3 different methods of seaming stitches to stitches. This is in conjunction with a series of videos that I'm creating on comparing seaming methods. You'll find the playlist up in the corner, up in that corner over there, that you can click on it and watch the other videos if you want after you've watched this one. Be sure to stay tuned to the very end because I'm going to show you how to rip out the seaming methods and start over. So have fun! Okay, so let's get started with the first method. I'm going to take a piece of wool, seaming thread, and thread my tapestry needle. This is a size 18 tapestry needle. The eye's plenty big enough to get my worsted weight wool through easily. It's not so big. For example, you may see this needle a lot for seaming and knitting. It's too big for me. It distorts my stitches as I'm seaming. Just too big. I like this one, 18 gauge tapestry needle. You can get it at most craft stores in the sewing department. So I have my 2 pieces, the bind off edge here, bind off edge here. I'm going to put them together like this so the bind off edges are facing each other, and I'm going to use the standard seaming stitch to join these 2 pieces of fabric. You know, seaming is just one method of joining. So we're going to, let me get up close and personal here. We need to see the legs of these stitches down here. On the lower half, I'm going to be going into the center of a stitch and up in the center of the next stitch, so that the 2 legs I'm going under make a arrow pointing to the seaming edge. On the upper edge, I'm going to be actually going under both the legs of the same stitch, but again, the 2 legs come together and point to the seam. So keep that in mind. That makes it easy to remember which legs you're going to be going under. So we'll start over here with the selvage stitch. I'm coming up in the center of the selvage stitch. I'm going to go over here and I'm going to go under both legs of the selvage stitch. I'm going to come back here. I'm going to go back down in that selvage stitch and up in the next stitch over. And what I'm using here are the stitches that are just below the bind off. I'm not sewing through the bind off itself. And then I'm going under these 2 legs. In the middle of this stitch, up in the next one, so the 2 legs that I'm going under are pointing towards the bind off edge. Under 2 legs here that are pointing to the bind off edge. And I just keep going back and forth across the seam. And you can do this with joining the cast on edge to cast on edge, or a cast on edge to a bound off edge. It doesn't really matter. You go through the same steps, and you can see what I'm making looks like V's, like stitches, and it continues the column of stitches across the seam. If this yarn were the same color as this, once I pull this together, it would be very invisible. Even when I use this yarn, it's going to be very invisible. So we'll fast forward to the end of the seam. As you get across, you can, pull up your yarn. Just put your finger here, pull here. It'll pull those stitches together. And you can see how they travel. The columns of stitches travel uninterrupted across the seam. Every one does. Let's continue to the end. We'll fast forward some more. then when you get to the end, you just continue until you've used up all of the little legs of the stitches. And then we're going to pull the seaming thread tight again. Almost done. Now we're just going to pull this tight. And there we have our seam. Looks very nice all the way across. And then you steam this and you're done with this seam. This makes a nice shoulder seam. It has very little stretch. It's very sturdy. What prevents it from stretching is not only the seaming, but the two bound off edges of the two pieces that you're seaming together. And I'll compare this with the other two swatches in just a minute. Okay, so this method is the crocheted method, slip stitch crochet. Again, you're going to put both pieces together, right sides together, because you're going to be working it from the wrong side of the fabric. And again, we're going to need to be aware of those bind off stitches, even though they're sort of facing the right side of the work. We'll start by putting our crochet hook underneath both legs. Let me make this bigger so you can see what I'm doing. Both legs of one of the bind off stitches and both legs of a bind off stitch here. And then we're going to pull a piece of yarn through with the crochet hook. That's our first stitch. Then we're going to go under the next two legs. And the next two legs. Bring the yarn through. We do this all across the seam. Now, the advantage of the crochet versus the back stitch, is that it's a little faster and a lot easier to remove, because you're just going to, it's like removing a zip line. You're just going to undo the last slip stitch and pull on the yarn and it will come out. And I'll show that in the end here with all three swatches, how to remove them. It is fiddly. So we'll fast forward to the end of this as well. Let's try a second method on the second half of this. I'm just going to go directly under through a stitch and through a stitch instead of the bind off. So on the back of the work, you know, a stitch looks like a purl bump. So if I go under a stitch on the back here, I'm going to be going under this purl bump right here. That's going under the stitch. On the front, I'm going through the stitch below the bind off. And we'll see how this looks. We can compare these. I love comparisons. One more. Last one. Okay. So here we went right under the bind off edge. Here we seamed directly under the bind off stitches. Here we went into the row below the bind off. You can still see a little bit of the seaming thread. I don't see much difference in the overall fabric. They both look okay if the seaming thread were the same color, but you get what appear to be what I would call these dreaded 11s, where you don't see the seam traveling straight across. And we'll compare all three of these in just a minute. In this swatch, I'm going to be using the back stitch method to seam the two pieces together. Again, we have the two bind off edges next to each other, and for back stitch you need to work with the right sides together, wrong sides facing out. And I'm going to show you two different ways of doing it. I'm going to show going directly under the bind off and then going in the row below, and we can see how they look. So we'll start out, we're just going to come under. This is the back stitch method, so you always start coming forward and then going back. So we're coming under this bind off stitch right here from the end, from back to front, leave a little tail. Then we're going to go back one stitch. So I'm going to go under these two bind off legs, under these two bind off legs. And you want to go under both bind off legs, otherwise one will show through to the front. Pull your yarn through. Let me make this a little bigger so you can see what I'm doing. Then you go two steps forward. So here we are. We go 1, 2, and under that bind off both legs. And then you come back 1 and go under both legs. Snug it up. And you go forward 1, 2, and back 1. Forward 2, back 1. Forward 2, back 1, and let's see what this looks like. So in the end, we can still see a bit of the bind off there. So let's try it a little bit differently. Let's go, instead of coming under the bind off, we're going to go forward 2. Let's come through the middle of the stitch below the bind off. And the middle of this stitch, which is going to be where the purl bump is. And then we're going to go under here. It's hard to see to go back, and through this stitch. We're going right through the stitch now rather than just come forward 2. So we just did there. We're going to come forward here and under this stitch here. Then we're going to go back under this stitch and in this same stitch. So we're going to go forward to 1, 2, come to the stitch below, the stitch below, go through this one, and this one. It's hard to see on this. Let's do some more of that. Make sure we don't go into the middle of the bind off. That's the trick. Let's see how that's looking. That looks better because you can't see the bind off edge there. So we'll continue in this method. So it's two different ways. You can go use the bind off itself or use the stitch below the bind off. Almost done. Okay, we're going to stop here and take a look at this. Doesn't have much stretch. So on this part we can still see the edges of the bind off. Here we don't see the edges of the bind off. We do see, well, let's compare it with the other swatches now, okay? Let's compare all three swatches. Okay, so we have all three methods here. This is the standard seaming method. And when you look at this one, you can see that the columns of stitches travel across. So this column of V's fits right down into this column of V's. They go straight across the seam. It has very little stretch. When this is blocked, and if you stretch it out, looks very nice. You don't see any of the seaming thread. I'm stretching this. And that thread was white, remember? The thread's white. And you'll want to stay tuned to the very end of this because I'm going to show you how to take these out too. This is the back stitch, so on this side it looks like this. On this side it looks like this. I want to show you both sides of this. Both sides of this, the seaming thread is way down in there, and the thread goes from here to here. There's no doubling back or anything, so it uses very little thread. You're not adding a lot of bulk to the seam. In this one, you go 2 steps forward, 1 back, 2 forward, 1 back. This is what one side looks like. This is what the other side looks like. And this first part we did just directly under the bind off stitches. And on the second part we went in the row below the bind off stitches. So let's look at that. In this part, when you open it up, you can see parts of the bind off. It doesn't look very tidy. Over here you cannot see the bind off, but the columns of stitches do not match up. They butt up against each other. For example, here is a column of V's coming down and it ends right here. What it connects to is a column of upside down V's here. So they butt up and you can see some of the seaming thread. So that is the back stitch method. This is the crocheted slip stitch crochet method. In the first half we went directly under the bind off, and the second half we went into the row below. It has about the same, this has the least stretch. Well, they're all about the same stretchiness. They're good firm bind offs. We open this one up, and in the first half where we were just going under the very bind off edge, we can still see bits of that bind off through. Over here, in going 1 row below the bind off, we don't see any of the bind off edge, but we still see some of the seaming thread. And again, we can see that the columns do not line up. Here's a column of V's, and it butts up with upside down V's here. None of these V's travel across the seam. All three methods are acceptable. It's your personal preference. And I'd like you to comment below which one you think is your personal preference. So let me show you now how to take these out. Let's start with the crocheted one. So you just take your loop and you just pull it out. And the seam is gone. The back stitch one, you cannot just pull it out. This is in here. And how you get this one out is you would use a seam ripper or scissors, and you have to cut every single one of these loops, being careful to not cut your working yarn if you were going to take this out. You have to cut every single one of these. A seam ripper works good too. You still have to be careful to not cut the underlying yarn, and if you were working a seam in the same color of yarn as your fabric, it's really hard to tell the difference. They kind of blend in together. So you can kind of pull it apart. It's very much like removing a seam in sewing. You got to pull out all these pieces. Okay, so that's the one with the back stitch. So we've got that apart now with all of our little pieces. Now this is the one that is the traditional seaming method, and I just call it a vertical seam, where the V's cross, the columns line up perfectly, and you just take one end and you pull it out just like that. Very, very easy to remove. If you like my videos, be sure to give me a thumbs up, subscribe to my YouTube channel, share my videos with your friends. Also, leave me comments down below. You can go ahead and click and leave the comment. You can read either other people's comments. You can share my videos in your social media groups, Ravelry, Facebook, Patternworks, any of those social media areas. I would appreciate that. Helps more people see my videos and come back and watch some more. Take care and happy knitting.